Well, hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, a photographer based in Northern California, and today we're checking out this tiny little manual focus 50mm f2 lens by AstrHori, and they sent this to me. It's $67. It's the cheapest full frame 50mm lens available, and we're going to be testing on the highest resolution full frame sensor, the Sony A7RV 61 megapixel sensor. So we'll see how this looks. I took it out to Muir Woods, which is a beautiful natural redwood, old growth redwood forest that's in Marin County, just outside of San Francisco. And I thought that'd be an interesting place to test it out and to talk through some of the strengths and weaknesses of this very inexpensive manual focus 50mm lens. So this lens is kind of an interesting choice. It's very cheap, but there are pretty reasonably priced 50mm lenses out there in the kind of nifty 50 or thrifty 50 range of about $200 US. So, to choose a manual focus lens over an autofocus lens, it's an interesting choice. I think this lens comes with a lot of character. We'll talk about bokeh, we'll talk about sharpness, we'll talk about color fringing and the kind of build quality of this lens. We'll talk through all of that. But I think right up off the bat, right up front, you choose this lens because you want something inexpensive, but you also want something that's kind of fun to use, that has a bit of character in the field, and is a interesting looking lens. It's an enjoyable experience. And maybe we'll talk about build quality first, because I think it is relevant to that decision. The build quality is actually really nice. It's an all metal lens. The focus ring and the aperture ring are both clickless. They move very smoothly. I have no friction at all. Well, there's friction, but there's no catching. There's no grinding. There's nothing bad about the movement. It's really nice. It's got a textured grip on the lens, so they've kind of etched into the metal a kind of cross-hatching pattern. It's really nice to hold and to use in the field. It's nice to not have a plastic or rubberized lens. It's just metal, and I kind of like that. It has a metal mount. There's no contacts, so you're not going to have any digital electronic communication between the lens and your camera. That means you're not going to get things like EXIF data, so you won't know your aperture that you shot it at. You won't know, well, you will know the ISO and you will know the shutter speed, I think, because those are collected in the camera, but you won't know the aperture. It doesn't really matter to me. You also won't know where the focus point is, obviously, because it's manual focus. So, it's a nicely built lens as a 52mm filter thread, which is a really common one. It would be easy to use this with like a ProMIS filter. So anyway, I like the build quality. It's nice and solid in the hand. It does not weigh much because it's so tiny, and it's really nice to use in the field. So next thing I want to talk about is sharpness. I mean, this is something that is the big question, I think. That's certainly the one I had with this lens. It's interesting. When you nail focus and you have a really nicely exposed image, you get a pretty sharp image, even on like the A7R5 at 61 megapixels, the full resolution. So like one example is I took these photos of just the canteen or the cafe at Muir Woods, and they had some bit of a wait, and they had some soft drinks and some water and things like that. So I just took some shots, relatively close distance of those, and I was surprised at the sharpness. When holding it still, the IBIS in the camera was effective, and I was able to get these fairly sharp shots that have a lot of detail and certainly aren't leaving me for wanting. It's not going to be as sharp as like the 50mm GM, but it's not supposed to be. It's a $67 lens, so you certainly can get really nice sharp shots with this. I think the sharpness, as we'll see with color fringing, is very sensitive to the aperture. It's a pretty soft lens. It's low contrast. It's not going to be a sharp wide open. It's at f2 or f1.7 is a little bit of a caveat with this lens. It can actually shoot a little bit wider than f2. At those apertures, it's not that sharp, it's not that contrasty. Now, the reasons why you might want to shoot that way, and we'll talk about bokeh in a second, but if you're going for the sharpest image, that seemed to be around f5.6, which is part and parcel of this thing. It's a pretty standard, situation for a lens like this, where the sharpest area is kind of in the mid-range of that aperture before the impacts of diffraction set in. And that's the same thing here. So I saw peak sharpness around f5.6, and I did a couple series of shots where I was looking at different apertures to see which was sharpest, and that was my conclusion. Let's talk about something that isn't as positive, which is color fringing. This lens exhibits a fair amount of color fringing. You have a lot of green and some purple hues, depending on if you're in kind of past the focal plane or before it. But it's very clear color fringing, particularly wide open. It's quite bad actually at f2 or f1.7. By f2.8, color fringing was manageable. It was noticeable, but manageable. Again, $67, guys. Not expecting the world here, but there is a bit of color fringing. And for someone who's a little bit like obsessive about Loca, that kind of bothered me a little bit. On the other hand, at f2.8, it's certainly usable, and you wouldn't necessarily see it if you weren't looking for it. And I'm kind of wondering if you even see the color fringing in some of these larger frame images where you capture the whole frame and you're not cropping. So even though it wasn't as sharp wide open, even though there was color fringing, I actually shot this lens at Muir Woods mainly wide open at f1.7 or f2. The reason why I shot that is because the bokeh is really nice on this lens. I thought it was very soft. There wasn't any weird onion ring effect. No, not terrible cat's eye. It was a bit of cat's eye, but it wasn't too bad. Really nice, soft bokeh, wide open. And it has a lot of character. And again, that's coming back to why I think this lens is cool. Because if you want character in your images and you want something that looks a little bit unique, yes, it might look soft. Yes, there might even be color fringing. But the bokeh is really nice. It has this kind of low contrast look that I really actually quite liked. The colors were nice out of it too. So I had this nice experience shooting it wide open, even though it wasn't as sharp. And I tended to leave it in that wide open setting at the dot, which is, I think, f1.7. So very good marks, in my opinion, for the bokeh. So I also did a little evaluation of sunstars, shooting at the narrowest aperture, so f16. By f8, I was starting to see sunstars. By f16, which is the narrowest this can go, which isn't super narrow, I had actually fairly nice sunstars. It helps a little bit when you get the sun, in between the leaves, so just a little bit's peeking through it creates kind of a more vibrant sunstar. It's certainly a little bit more dramatic and a little sharper than if you just shoot like a sunstar in the wide open sky. But pretty nice sunstars out of this. Now, it's not the best and it's not the worst, but it's not horrible. So I wanted to finish it up with just a little bit of like why you would shoot a manual focus lens in the first place. I mean, we have incredible autofocus systems. I shoot the Z8, I shoot the A7RV. These are phenomenal autofocus. So I never use manual unless I'm just correcting for some slight miscalculation on the autofocus and I want to bring the subject back into the frame and to bring it into focus. So I do correcting in manual focus, but I don't really shoot a manual focus lens. So this was sort of an interesting experience for me. It's kind of why I was interested in testing it in the first place when they reached out to me. And I will say, it's trite, and I think people say this all the time, but there is truth to it. And I say that coming from my experience too. When you shoot manual focus, it slows you down. You have to take the time to focus your shot. You're adjusting the focus ring. You're thinking about aperture. You're thinking about shutter speed. It's just really effective at slowing down the photography process. And in a place like Muir Woods, where I was just walking around, having a blast, just looking for different compositions and seeing what I could pick up, it was really fun to shoot manual. And I guess you could say, yeah, your lenses are manual. I'm filming this on the 35mm GM. It's a great lens. It can switch to manual focus if I need it to. But I don't do it. And I don't do it because I just don't. The autofocus is so good, it would be kind of silly to. But this lens forced me to, and I kind of had a great time doing it. So I guess it opened my eyes a little bit to why so many people shoot manual focus lenses, particularly the old vintage ones, and why those are really fun to use in the field. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to shoot this, and I think it's worth picking up a manual focus lens, particularly one that looks good and is fun to use and has character, because I think it opens your eyes to new compositions and new ways of experiencing photography that's very pleasurable in the field. All right, take care. See you in the next video.